Hi there, this is Susan Regan, and I wanted to share a few thoughts that I had about codependency. I'm bringing up this subject because a lot of folks in my groups struggle with codependency, and actually, what is the healthy codependency? It's interdependency, and there's a lot of talk about what codependency is. So I wanted to just define codependency and interdependency. Let me start with interdependency since it's a healthier term. So we're all in relationships with somebody, friends, workmates, family, neighbors, our intimate partners, and we all depend on people to some extent. And so there's a healthy way to depend on people where you know what your boundaries are, you actually feel like you have a say about things, and you have a choice about things. You're not feeling manipulated, provoked, like you can't live without anybody in relative terms. And so there's a healthy interdependency that we all have as human beings. As humans, we interact in groups. We interact in social situations. We're social animals. So interdependency is important, right? We're not operating solo in the world. It's impossible to do that because we have society and systems set up all around us, which create places where we have to interact with others. But codependency is a term that doesn't just mean that you were a woman with an alcoholic and you can't live without them and you're enabling them. It doesn't only mean that. It means that, but it doesn't only mean that. So codependency, in order to really understand codependency, means an unhealthy dependency on somebody else, that you don't feel like you have a say or a choice, and that you almost feel like you're filling a void with that role that you're playing with the other person or people in your life. And it gets confusing. You don't know where to set the boundaries. You don't know how to set the boundaries, and you don't really have a solid sense of self in certain areas. And so you're very influenced by the way that people engage with you and the way that you choose to engage with them. So in order to fully understand codependency, we really have to look at our own origins and where we learned our attachment styles with folks, and where we learned how to be engaged with people, and what our learned behavior was from that modeling, and what coping mechanisms developed. So that's some of what I'm going to unravel in this podcast today. Much of what we learn in our families is the modeling of how people get their needs met, and whether or not needs are met or whether needs are neglected, and kind of looking at sort of untangling things like the need for validation versus the fear of abandonment versus the desire to please and be noticed. So happiness in codependency is often dependent on external validation. And so it confuses the whole idea about boundaries and how to have boundaries and how to have healthy boundaries. Because if boundaries are attached to whether or not your needs are getting met, you're going to have wobbly boundaries because your ultimate desire is to have your needs met. So whatever way you need to do that is going to affect your behavior and what you say yes and no to, or if you feel like you even have any agency in saying no, because an action might be really associated with getting your needs met. So what would be an example of that? So in the past, when I've done a lot of family therapy, one of the things to notice is, like, very slightly and very obviously, sometimes you can notice the roles that different family members take. And it's really interesting because I always know when I am entering into a family system that I get into the family system if I start making mistakes. And that means like I'm buying into the roles that everybody has and sort of trying to validate everybody in their roles. So for example, there's always a notable, like, is there competition in the family? Is there a favorite person in the family? Is somebody in charge of, all the caretaking and all the tasks? Is someone else involved in making people happy? Is someone else involved in like expressing the anger for the family? So I always look at what is the roles, that the sort of predisposed roles that people have in a family. So one of the things to think back, if you're sort of checking out, hey, where is my codependency? What would you say? My codependency scale, and do I have codependency, and did I learn any of that in my family? Take a look at, like, how did your parents treat your siblings and yourself? Like, how did you know they were proud of you? How did you know they were angry? How did you know they were in conflict? How did problems get solved? How was time spent? What were some of the stressors in the family? What was some of the ways the family got along, and what was some of the ways the family struggled? These are all really great questions to ask yourself about your own family situation. And sometimes there's this unconscious behavior that happens in families, and I notice it sometimes also when I'm doing some parent coaching, when I'm noticing that certain parents have certain roles with kids. Like one of the parents might be the disciplinarian, and the other parent might be the parent that constantly praises the kids. And so noticing for yourself, did you feel like you were kind of etched into a certain role in your family? And what was it? And did you feel like you had choices? This is one way to start looking at, are you just duplicating and mimicking roles that you had in your family? And are you still doing that in your relationships now? And what could they possibly be? For example, placating. Placating is such a great term, because placating is that you just don't really know what you want, but what your goal is to try to please the people around you. And why would you try to please the people around you? It could be you want to just be liked, or it could be that you're just trying to make things better for the group. And so the way that you can do this is by just building on the idea that your role is to always be that person that smooths things out. Remember that this isn't codependency, or if you have codependency in your family, this didn't start just with your family. This is usually a generational thing that's been passed on by 3 generations. So if you're also just thinking, okay, I want to really look at my family now, what's going on with my family? Look at the past and what your family has been through. A lot of times people are coming into this country and they might be the 2nd generation in, or there could have been a change in social status. Like, for example, people might have jumped a class status up or down in a generation, and that will have an effect on how people function in a family. It's not uncommon to see people that come into the country and start establishing their status or their life in this country. They might be also coming in a certain status and jumping or lowering their status just to kind of figure out how they're going to adjust and create the next generation here. So there's going to be an effect. Like sometimes families come in and they have a really strong work ethic, and there you have it, that there would be a whole bunch of coping mechanisms that come into play because everyone in the family is expected to work really hard and work a lot. And so therefore, roles get a little bit messed up. Like the parents might not be around, so the older kids are becoming more of the parents and more of the caretakers of the family. So just notice, what were the patterns in your family 2 generations above you, and what were some of the themes that went on in your family? I think about that a lot with my family, and how they gathered in one area of the country, and how the expectations for education and wealth and even how people socialize and where people vacation and what kinds of jobs people get. All of that got really, and what kind of relationships people have, and whether people got married or whether they were allowed to get divorced, how many kids they had, all of that stuff was sort of predisposed. A lot of it was based on how did that family work together as a group. And if there was things like, mental health issues or illness and things like that, you start seeing an adaptation. So it's so interesting to look at generational patterns. We learn so much from that. But I want to get back to codependency for a second and think about, okay, codependent families and family roles. So some of the main things that I've learned as a therapist over the years is the whole idea about the enabler, the hero, the scapegoat, the lost child, and the mascot. So those are pretty self-explanatory. And, someone is expected to do something for one of the lead people, right? And if like one parent is the enabler, the other parent is the dependent, so the one that might have the issue with some kind of substance, or even the workaholic has to be backed up by somebody who's going to take over and do all the other components. The hero is the person who's allowed to shine, that they're always right, they're always revered. The scapegoat is the one, the child or the person in the family who always takes the blame for everything. The lost child, I know sometimes my clients tell me that they were the middle child, they're the lost child, the one that wasn't paid attention to. They were just kind of, lost in the crowd. The oldest child got attention, the youngest child got attention, but the middle child was lost. And the mascot is the one that's the charming one that sort of gets away with a lot, because the way that they draw attention to themselves is in a placating way, but they kind of get to be looked at as someone who's like bringing entertainment into the family. So there's lots of ways that this codependency label can be looked at in a family system. And I wonder, those are the basic roles, right? And so I wonder if you can see some of the roles that you played in your family and that other family members played that defined your role even more. So if we look at like sibling relationships, it's not uncommon to see that sometimes siblings like have a great relationship with each other, and sometimes siblings have a very competitive relationship with each other. But who's keeping the competition going? And what did that train the child to believe about themselves and about how they need to relate to other people? So this is a really important point, is to look at the origins of the role that you played in your family. And I am saying this over and over again to my clients, but we translate that into the people that we meet, into the people we're attracted to, into the positions we take in our own lives. So I want to really acknowledge that the idea about your relationship and your relationship struggles, or your relationship conquests, or your relationship happiness has roots somewhere else. And let's look at that together. So I wanted to add a little bit more to what I've just been talking about, and I wanted to be a little bit more succinct about a few points that I think are really important. So one is, defining again codependency. And so codependency basically comes out as a person who is prioritizing other people's needs over their own, and they're taking care of other people's responsibility, sometimes instead of taking care of their own or themselves, and they're like doing too much, being too hypervigilant in terms of not their own needs, but more of the needs of everyone around them, as almost like a survival mode. And then there's also the focus on approval seeking, for the simple fact that if they don't get approval by almost being like putting themselves on the back burner, then something might happen to them or to other people. It's almost a way of measuring some kind of control. And early on in somebody's life, the way that you would develop codependency is that you would notice that people are modeling that they need help. And at a very young age, you're noticing that the one way that you can survive better is by taking care of other people's needs. And oftentimes, you're doing this behavior when you really don't have the capacity to do it. And so that idea or pattern of feeling like you're doing something and you don't really have the capacity to do it, so it stresses you or strains you, but somehow the strain and the stress seem like a sacrifice that you have to make and you don't have a choice about that. So approval seeking means like it's better to do stuff to feel like you're going to be liked than to cause controversy or even confront something that you don't like. It's just too tenuous. Will put you in too tenuous of a situation. So there's 3 things that need to be considered if you're trying to recover from codependency. And that is that typically if you're prioritizing everything but yourself, especially as you age, there's a little bit of a self-sacrificing component, maybe not even a little, maybe a lot. And that typically your self-esteem, the way you feel about yourself, doesn't really matter. And that you start substituting your value for other people's value. So in order to heal from codependency, one of the ways to focus is to start building your self-esteem and confidence, which means actually pulling the focus onto yourself and starting to find your self-worth and create boundaries so that you practice saying no not as hard as self-sacrificing, and that through practice you realize and start to know why that feels so much better. And some of that needs to be an investigation of your own personal trauma history and what's happened to you in relationships. Because sometimes people don't even notice that they overdo. They're just so used to being in the position of taking care of people that they always know what they're supposed to do whenever they walk into a situation. They're the person that takes care, that controls, that goes into action. And that way you always have a role. You always feel safe. You always know what your role is. But over time, I think people get worn out by this role. So some of it is, increasing your self-esteem, doing your own trauma work around your own trauma that happened to you in your life, and then starting to establish this sense of doing things for yourself first. That concept of like, take care of yourself first before you take care of anyone else, especially that sort of overused phrase of, put your own oxygen mask on first and then your child's. So it is that concept. But I think it's even more than that. It's like not only in emergency situations, but always making sure that you spend time taking great care of yourself every day, and not putting yourself last. What other things about codependency that are important to say? That sometimes codependency and having a codependent personality or being in a situation where you developed codependency, that it tends to lead to unhealthy attachments because your attachment to people is really based on the concepts of prioritizing them more, self-sacrificing, taking care of them more, approval seeking. So you're not really being really yourself in attachment. And you might be attracted to people that you can help, because you know what your role is in those situations. Otherwise, you don't know how to be. And depending on this role of a caretaker of another person helps give you an identity, right? About your own identity. And actually, when you take care of somebody and you feel like, hey, you really helped them, or you really can, or you really have the capacity to, or the skill set to do that, then you feel like it gives you your identity, and you feel like, well, maybe that's, it's not a bad thing, right? It's like I'm not doing anything terrible to somebody. But that becomes like a coping mechanism, right? And so instead of like taking care of yourself, focusing on yourself and having more reciprocity in a relationship, you just naturally go into a caretaking role. And it's a coping mechanism. So, like whenever you're nervous and you don't know what to do, you can be selfless, right? You don't have to be in a complicated back and forth relationship. And that the focus of the caretaking role becomes your life, right? It becomes something that you over-identify with. But when we're in relationships like that, especially in partnerships like that, we don't even consider that maybe we're unhappy in the relationship. But if you think about it, if your role in the relationship is to always prioritize and take care of somebody else and overdo and do the stuff they can't do, then and not have value and not feel your own value, that maybe you're not even considering for quite a bit of time, that you might not be very happy. So where's your sense of happiness, contentment, feeling good about yourself, feeling like you're valued? Where does that go? Does it just become not important anymore? Or do you live with loneliness, or live with not feeling special or important to somebody, or just like taken advantage of or taken for granted? So maybe in codependency, people's happiness isn't even a consideration. So I want to give you a few tools. And one is to start looking at your relationship history and some of the patterns of the kinds of relationships you have, the kinds of people you're attracted to, the kind of roles you play. And you can even do a review for yourself. Like, let's talk about the last 5 years. What kind of friendships did you have? Or in that time period, have they always been the same? What kind of ways do you spend your time? What's your closest people? What's your role with them? How do you know you're cared for and loved? How do you know you're valued? What's your sense of your own value? These are really some things to consider. Look at your long history in your life. Like, what have you been through? I talked a little bit about what your generations of your family have been through. What have your models of relationship been like? And then a lot of times in codependency, we confuse what love is. Like, what is love? Do you remember that? I don't know if this might date me, but there used to be this like comic strip that was like, love is ... And I wonder if you could say 3 things like, what is love? Love is ... Love is never having to say you're sorry. Love is feeling like you never have to say anything and your partner knows who you are. Whatever that might be sort of a corny Hallmark thing. But what is love to you? Love can come in many different forms. But in intimate relationships and partnerships, what is love to you? And sometimes I think if you're coming from a codependent identity, love might be feeling sorry for someone and trying to really help them because you feel sorry for them. So I want to take a minute to talk about some of the other things to consider in terms of tools. And, I wanted to also just tell you a little story I know when I work in my clinical practice and in groups, it's really interesting to hear people speaking about their own recovery and what they're struggling with and in. And it's really interesting when people give each other feedback. And some of the feedback that I think has been really helpful is when people can see that other people are focusing not on their own feelings, but on how they are ruminating that other people might be feeling. And getting that feedback in a place where people are resonating with, hey, I'm struggling with how to have healthy relationships. So I can tell you that when I'm talking to you or when I hear you talk, that you're focusing more on other people than you are on yourself, or are really not figuring out how to make your life better, but you're continuing to focus on making other people's lives better. That's huge to hear that kind of feedback from someone who understands and knows, so that you can get, and this is important, I think, when we get feedback about codependency and are able to talk about it, to hear that from other people, like really understand, like this is challenging stuff to change, especially if it was a way of coping with a situation and with closeness or with living life. Changing a codependent tendency is really shaming. It doesn't, I think a lot of times when people struggle with codependency, it's really shaming, because it's almost like once you start recognizing it, or you feel like people recognize it, it feels like the veil's been lifted, and maybe you're just half a person after all, and that somehow the codependent behavior protected you, and that's what I've been able to see, this very gentle approaching codependent characteristics in oneself, and then hearing other people able to talk about and look into or unpack their own codependent tendencies, and trying not to feel so judged by just that look, because it's so easy to just go back to like, I'm just going to purely caretake, because when you caretake and you get in this role of prioritizing another person, right, it kind of gives you a buffer, a place to go, something to do, a protection in a way. And when you start unpacking it, I think there's almost a feeling of underneath it, like there's nothing here for me. I'm actually like, don't really have an identity other than this. So it can be really scary. So if you are thinking, hey, I really feel like I have some codependent tendencies, really get with other folks who have some recovery going on, and exploration and conversation about codependency, because then it will make it feel like demystified, and there's strength in that. When you hear other people's stories about how they weren't able to hold boundaries, or how they felt exhausted and resentful and they couldn't really talk about it or taken advantage of. And when you hear that, like in a CODA meeting, Codependence Anonymous, it's a relief, because then you can see that you're not the only one, and that this is a day by day, step by step, hour by hour, really practicing a different mindset challenge and recovery process. So I want you to give yourself a break. So this is like break time. I just went through a whole bunch of codependent information. It's heavy. It might make you feel bad. And I want you to just have a little bit of a moment here to relax. So let's do this together. Let's just take a few deep breaths and like, okay, we're going to just erase the chalkboard for a minute, reset. And what I'm going to go into now is just giving you some tools and different ways to think about this, so that you can, start having some strategies and a plan in place for yourself. So the next time you are in a situation, for example, where you're starting to feel like, okay, I know my role. I could walk in here. I could get everything done, set up. I could do that for that other person. I could overstretch myself. I could overgive. Whenever you feel like you're in that situation again, like that's your coping mechanism, and you might not feel it. It might be so ingrained that you don't feel it at all. But I want you to start noticing things like when you overdo, when you're exhausted, when you've given too much. And okay, so yeah, of course, we could all do something different, do something better, but we first have to observe it and get the cueing right, because we've been miscued. We've just like automatically gone into that instead of taking a pause, figuring out, is that what I want to do, walking away for a minute, sticking with our plan, not letting anyone, upset our day, like having boundaries around that. So you got to get the cueing first. Like, how do you know you're doing that? Do you feel it in your body? Do you feel anger? Like, hey, wait a second, I don't have a choice. Like someone just signed me up to make the dinner, wash the clothes, clean the house, pick up the kids. And I didn't have a choice about that, or I didn't give myself a choice about that. I want the first tool to be is notice, observe, check in with your body. What's the feeling? And then I want you to pause. And instead of going into reacting to it, and reacting could be just like going right into the action, I want you to actually respond and ask yourself first, what do you want to do for yourself first? If you could do one thing for yourself first before you start the caretaking role, what would that thing be? What would that thing be that you could do for yourself? And maybe it's like, all I can do is really take a breath and open the window and look outside. That's all I can do. Or maybe the only thing I can do is be prepared, like have a plan. Like I know one time I gave a tool to somebody that I used myself for a long time is I actually wrote something down, like more of a mantra, and I kept it with me in my purse, in my wallet, and I would take it out and I would read it, and it would say something like, it's not what you do today, it's how you feel balanced. And that's all you need to focus on today is feeling balanced. So I might say, I'm really hungry. I'm going to have to eat something first. I might just read that message. And that's all I get to do is read that message over and over again. But I might read that message and I might come up with an action of something to do for myself first. And that doesn't mean going right into action for somebody else, right? Because sometimes we're like always geared towards the crisis, the chaos, like, oh my gosh, that thing happened. I have to do this thing now. My day is just going to be packed now. I'm going to have to jam and drive as fast as I can to pick that up or do that thing. Well, what if it doesn't happen and you don't do it? Like it might be just dealing with the feelings that would come up with not going into action just for this time, just practicing new behavior. So I gave you 3 examples of new behavior, right? One is to stop, cue in, notice, observe. 2 is to do something for yourself first. That might be just not going into instant action, maybe to have a reminder that you wrote down somewhere of some place you want to focus. Like, don't do anything, just see if you can feel balanced in yourself. And then if that might lead to doing an action for yourself, right? So maybe it's 4 things. So that's one tool I want you to consider. Okay, second tool is there's the internal you and there's the external world. And sometimes we're ruminating about the external world. And we're like, if I don't do that thing, right, I'm catastrophizing. That person's going to get mad at me. The bill's not going to get paid. They're not going to get the groceries. They're not going to follow through. So there's the whole rumination thing that's going on. So I want you to pull back from the external world and the thinking that you do about the external world, because sometimes we're putting that judgment and those projections of the catastrophic thinking, we're putting that on ourselves, and that's making us change our mind about what we want to do, right? So I want you to try to let go of the projection. Like, I'm not listening to outside me, I'm only listening to inside me. And right now, inside me can actually stay and sit and not do anything for 5 minutes. I think I might be able to do that. I think I might be able to, before I feel like I have to save anybody, I'm going to actually eat something. Or I'm actually not going to jump out of bed, because whenever I get to that thing that's being asked of me, I'll get to it. But I'm not going to get to it right now. And I'm going to just remind myself that it's okay, and I'm going to be okay if I don't go right into action. And I'm not going to be catastrophizing like that person's going to have a hard time or not be okay. Because that might be the messages that brought the pressure, that pushed you into pushing yourself into doing an action for someone else instead of listening to yourself. So it's almost like what I'm asking you is, how much can you tolerate of just staying in your own space internally instead of responding to the external messages that you're starting to get, and then the bigger messages that you might be creating, that projection messages, that judgment, guilt, shame messages. So I want you to see if you can slow down and notice the difference between inside of you and having peaceful thoughts about yourself, and at least starting to have some thoughts for yourself, about yourself, and then not letting the external messages take over. And my third tool for you is, how about your body? You know, your body gives you lots of messages about tension and stress. And maybe your body's feeling so tense and so stressed about all this stuff that you're just, not doing well. I think a lot of times, I've noticed anyways, with people that have codependency, that push themselves to do too much, have a lot of stress symptoms like headaches, stomach aches. They don't have any time that they exercise or relax, or any relaxation routines or exercise routines, or even just taking a walk or sitting and having lunch. Like, it's hard. It's hard to stop. And so I wonder if you could just for a second just feel your body. And what's the most relaxed part of your body that you can feel right now? And can you make it even more relaxed, like your shoulders? And breathe into that a little bit, like your stomach. Like, what's your stomach saying? Is it okay? Like, can you release it? And sometimes I think headaches are just that stress, like everything's starting to collect in your head, all these things you're supposed to do, all this thinking that you're having. And if you can just like release that very inside of your brain, just let it release. And so just notice, what part of your body can you relax just a little bit more? Okay, let's check in again. What part of your body is tense? What part can you relax a little bit more? Okay, there you go. So one of the biggest messages that's being unraveled in this codependent podcast that I'm doing for you is the focus is to start putting the focus. The focus of recovery is to start putting the focus on you. On you. On what do you need for yourself. Always first. Always first. Always something for you. There's always something for you. In every day, in every situation, right? So if you come in and you're going to come in the door and clean up somebody's kitchen, I want you to do something for yourself first. Always for you first. I want to end with a positive visualization for you, which is the last tool I'm going to give you. And I love visualizations because I think we can ride on them in our minds for a long time. But I want you to have a vision of your life and what you'd really like your life to look like. And you don't have to do the whole gamut, the whole picture, but maybe just like what you want to have a little bit more of that might lead you to feeling content or happy. What would it be if you could have any vision for yourself? What could it be? And maybe with that you could develop a mantra that you say to yourself. I remember I went to someone's house and they were really working on their recovery, and they had all these little yellow stickies all over their house to remind themselves, smile, just look at yourself and look how beautiful you are, or you're the best, or I love you, or keep going, or give yourself a break, or notice how much you try for others, or something like that, like all these positive affirmations. So I want you to think about a positive affirmation / mantra that you can say to yourself. And, sometimes I do this tapping technique, which I'll teach in a different podcast, but and sometimes if I'm very stressed when I wake up in the morning, I might do this tapping technique, and I'll tap in like, everything is okay. Everything is okay. You're going to be fine. You're going to figure it out. You're doing better and better every day. Focus on just having loving thoughts for yourself today. Focus on everything that you are doing well today. Focus on every positive sign you get from the universe today, or notice every positive sign, or say hello to everybody that looks you in the eye and smile. Those kinds of things. That's the forward motion of bringing more positive things into your life and going toward your happiness and contentment. And it could be a moment by moment. It could be a visual, like, I want to have more friends in my life. I want to have more free time. I want to have more time to lay on the grass and look up at the sky. Something like that. So this kind of concludes my podcast, but it's not going to be the only one on some of the codependent ideas that I have around recovery, understanding yourself, not pathologizing, and working on staying connected with yourself and really having compassion for your own history, your family's history, how you developed some of the characteristics that you have. And change is possible. It is definitely possible, and so is evolution, self-evolution. And I think it's so, so exciting to get to know every aspect of yourself and to put shame away so that you can look at yourself with loving kindness. I look so forward to continuing to have discussion with you about all these ideas about psychology and self-growth. So don't hesitate to reach out if you have any comments or concepts that you want to share with me. I'd love to hear from you.